Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cutting through all the pomp and ceremony, really. We're tackling an institution that's often, romanticized, maybe even revered, the monarchy. We're taking a deep dive into this absolutely fascinating, comprehensive, AI-driven scientific analysis. It's really dissected the core principles, the historical impact, and, well, the legacies that endure.
Yeah, it's quite something.
Our mission here is to strip away that mystique, understand how this ancient system truly operates, what it actually built, and what it leaves behind for all of us today. So get ready, maybe uncover some surprising facts, perhaps challenge some assumptions you might have about power and history.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we're approaching monarchy not as like a cultural artifact to just admire, but really as a political system, a complex machine, if you will.
Yeah.
Something to be critically examined, just like any other political system. And this kind of objective analysis, it lets us look past the usual emotional baggage, and really understand its fundamental architecture, its power dynamics, its historical role. It's about seeing the engine, not just the gilded carriage.
Okay, so if we're cutting through the regalia, the parades, let's start at the absolute basics. What is monarchy? Like, what truly defines it as a political system?
Well, at its core, monarchy is basically a system based on the undivided rule of a single person, right? The monarch. And they get their position through heredity.
Through birth.
Exactly. Which is, of course, a stark contrast to democracy, literally rule by the people. But what's really critical to grasp here is that monarchy isn't just about that single ruler.
Oh, yeah.
It also fundamentally creates and sustains this distinct social group, the nobility, or you could call it the court society. Their very existence, their wealth, their status, it's completely symbiotic with that ruling dynasty. Their fates are totally intertwined.
And, well, to legitimize that kind of power, especially power passed down just by birthright, you need a story, a really powerful story.
Me too.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. This doctrine of divine right. How did that actually work? Was it just, a pious belief, or was there something more tactical going on?
Oh, it was far more than just piety. It was, you could call it a potent political technology, a tool.
Oh, technology.
Okay. The doctrine of divine right asserted that a monarch's authority came directly from God. Not from the people, not from the aristocracy, certainly not from any human institution like a parliament.
Right.
Which meant the monarch was accountable only to God. So any resistance, any attempt to depose them or even just limit their power, it was framed as sacrilegious, a direct defiance of God's will.
Wow. So basically untouchable.
Pretty much. And this theory, it evolved over time. It started from medieval ideas of dual authority God granting temporal power to rulers and spiritual power to the church.
Right. The two swords idea.
Exactly. But ambitious monarchs like Henry VIII of England.
Obvious example.
And Louis XIV of France, they really weaponized it. They used it to consolidate absolute power, often against powerful feudal lords, and sometimes even against the Roman Catholic Church itself. They effectively became heads of both state and the national church.
So this divine right, this God-given authority, it really sounds like a strategic tool then for state building, for consolidating absolute power. And it's fascinating that theorists even tried to give it this natural justification. You mentioned Jacques-Benin Bossuet saying the king's authority was like a father's, or Sir Robert Filmer tracing it back to Adam.
Yeah, trying to make it seem inevitable, natural.
But you're saying this wasn't just a European thing. This idea popped up elsewhere.
Not at all. And that's what's truly fascinating, this fusion of divine and political power. It's a recurring strategy. You see it across cultures, continents, millennia.
Like where?
Well, think of China's mandate of heaven. A ruler's legitimacy depended on divine approval. Or how the Japanese emperor was seen as a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu.
Right.
The Egyptian pharaohs were considered divine beings themselves, blurring that line between king and god. Even rulers like King David in the Bible, seen as designated by prophets or crowned by high priests. This global parallel really highlights how universally ruling elites have tried to elevate their status beyond human challenge, make their authority seem inherent, absolute, unchallengeable.
Okay, that makes perfect sense from a power perspective. But then, if power comes directly from God, how does that logically translate to it passing down through bloodlines? Is that really logical? I mean, talent, wisdom, that doesn't always follow genetics, does it?
You've hit on a really fundamental point there, and it's where the logical cracks, they really start to show. Hereditary succession, the principle that the top job passes exclusively through a bloodline, it's fundamentally illogical. And profoundly anti-meritocratic.
Anti-meritocratic, right.
Leaders are chosen purely by accident of birth. It's basically a biological lottery, not a selection based on competence or experience or, the will of the people. Even way back, Aristotle warned about the undue risk of conferring power on someone incapable.
Right, it just feels completely arbitrary. So is there any scientific basis at all for inheriting qualities like wisdom or leadership ability?
None, absolutely none whatsoever. I mean, if we draw an analogy with, say, Mendelian genetics, we know physical traits are inherited through genes, right? But that process is governed by chance, countless variables.
Conflict.
There's simply no scientific basis for the idea that complex non-physical qualities like wisdom or justice or leadership ability are predictably passed down through bloodlines. Inheritance is it's a statistical roll of the dice. The whole notion of innate fitness to rule by bloodline is, quite frankly, a biological and logical fallacy.
So the story.
It's a political fiction. A convenient narrative designed to justify a closed system of power transfer. And philosophers have been pointing this out for centuries. Marsilius of Padua argued for elected rulers. John Milton famously called monarchy burdensome, expensive, useless, and dangerous.
Strong words.
And Jeremy Bentham just dismissed it as an absurdity based purely on custom.
So if it's so inherently flawed, so anti-meritocratic, why on earth did it stick around for so long? What's the real secret to its longevity then?
It's definitely not about good governance, not primarily anyway. The persistence of hereditary succession is mainly about ensuring stability and continuity for the ruling elite.
Ah, okay, the elite.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Power transfers are inherently unstable moments, right? They often lead to internal strife, civil wars, challenges from rivals. Hereditary succession gives a clear, simple, predictable, even if it's arbitrary rule for who's next.
Reduces infighting, maybe?
Exactly. Its primary function is to minimize internal conflict among the aristocracy for that top spot. And by doing that, it preserves the existing power structure and the interests of those already in power. It's fundamentally conservative and, well, deeply self-serving. It prioritizes the system's own survival over competence or the public good.
That puts a totally different spin on it. Less about benevolent rule, much more about just power maintenance. Let's dig into that. If we look at monarchy through a systems lens, like you said, dissecting the machine, what does that tell us about how the whole thing actually works?
Precisely. Yeah, using a systems perspective is really helpful here. We can analyze monarchy using a framework, looking at its inputs, how it converts them, the outputs it produces, and how it adapts through feedback. It helps strip away the ceremony and see the underlying engine.
Okay, so what are the typical inputs?
Inputs into a monarchy often include things like society's desire for a unifying symbol, maybe. The economic and political interests of the elite who depend on the monarch, naturally. And sometimes a collective wish for a strong state builder, perhaps to maintain order or expand territory.
And the conversion process.
Yeah.
How does it handle those inputs?
That's where you see the extreme concentration of power in the monarch's hands. They use force, they use ideology like divine right to suppress opposition. Decision-making is absolute or close to it, and it serves the interests of the monarch and, by extension, that ruling elite we talked about.
And the outputs, what did these systems historically pump out onto the global stage?
Historically, the outputs are pretty clear and shockingly consistent, actually. We see vast voyages of discovery leading to global land claims, the establishment of massive colonial empires, exploitative mercantilist trade systems, slave-based economies, and what political scientists call the authoritative allocation of values, which basically means the system systematically distributes wealth, power, and privilege to favored groups, often at the expense of others, usually vast populations.
And feedback, how does the system adapt?
Right. Feedback and adaptation. The most significant example is probably the evolution from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy.
Where the monarch reigns but doesn't rule, sort of.
Exactly. Faced with huge pressures, Enlightenment ideas, popular revolutions, the system adapted to survive. It ceded direct political power, but crucially, it managed to retain its symbolic role, immense wealth, and social status. This adaptation ensured its own persistence, just in a modified form.
So if I'm reading this systems analysis right, what we're really looking at here underneath all the crowns and jewels is less about leadership and more about a self-perpetuating elite power system. Is that the core takeaway here?
That's precisely it. It's perhaps the purest institutional form of elite theory you can find. The system uses its concentrated authority to generate outputs that directly benefit that elite.
Can you give an example of that loop?
Sure. Consider this. Monarchs sanctioned ventures, like the Royal African Company we mentioned. This company extracted immense wealth from colonies' resource plunder, slave labor. That wealth then flowed back into the system. It funded the monarch's treasury, strengthened the military, expanded the state bureaucracy.
So it feeds itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It creates this powerful positive feedback loop. Colonial exploitation abroad directly fuels the stability, power, and enrichment of the monarchical system at home. Its primary objective, when you look at it this way, isn't the welfare of its subjects. It's its own perpetuation and its own aggrandizement.
And if that's the core function, self-perpetuation, elite benefit, then what was its single most significant output globally? Our analysis here seems unequivocal. Colonialism. It wasn't some accident, was it? It seems it was conceived, driven, and sanctioned by these monarchical states. Let's really pull back the curtain on that. Maybe start with the British Crown. How directly involved were they?
The historical record is crystal clear on this. The British Empire in its entirety was created under the sovereignty of the Crown. It wasn't some rogue operation.
Okay.
From the earliest stages, the monarchy was an active participant and sponsor. Queen Elizabeth I, for instance. She personally supported and even helped fund voyages like those of Sir John Hawkins.
That's Hawkins.
The slave trader. He was the first known Englishman to systematically engage in the transatlantic slave trade, yes. She provided him with a vessel, the Jesus of Lubeck, for his second slaving voyage, and even granted him permission to fly the royal standard. That lent the full authority and prestige of the crown to these ventures. And she granted royal charters to people like Sir Walter Raleigh to colonize new lands in her name, legitimizing the whole process of expansion and exploitation.
And what about the Royal African Company? I've heard that name, but what was the royal family's actual role there? Was it just investment?
Oh, much more than just investment. The monarchy's role in the slave trade became fully institutionalized under the Stuarts. In 1660, King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, who later became King James II, they didn't just invest, they founded the Royal African Company.
They founded it.
They were its founders and its governors. This placed the royal family at the absolute heart of the English slave trade. The company held a royal monopoly, allowing it to control the horrific trafficking of over 187,000 enslaved Africans.
That number is staggering.
It is, and in a particularly chilling detail, many of these captives were branded with the initials DY for Duke of York, a literal branding of human flesh with a mark of royal property.
That's horrifying.
And when the Glorious Revolution led to James II losing his monopoly, the trade didn't stop. It actually led to a massive escalation by independent merchants. It unleashed a new wave of brutality in a way.
So the monarchy wasn't just profiting passively. They were actively shaping the brutal institutional structure of the slave trade itself. And it seems that pro-slavery stance lasted quite a while.
It absolutely did. Far from being enlightened figures on this, both King George III and his son, the Duke of Clarence, who later became King William IV, were powerful, systematic defenders of the slave trade.
Really?
George III, yes. The Duke of Clarence was incredibly vocal against abolition in the House of Lords. William Wilberforce, the famous abolitionist, noted that his interventions were understood to represent the sentiments of all the reigning family. They actively impeded abolitionist legislation, framing enslaved Africans as, quote, mere cargo or commodities.
Just property.
Exactly. King George III himself resisted measures against the trade, arguing against what he called false philanthropy that would affect the property of British settlers. Even earlier, Queen Anne had personally secured the lucrative asiento from Spain, a monopoly to supply thousands of enslaved Africans per year to Spanish colonies.
And the brand used for those captives included a crown, you mentioned.
Yes, the brand reportedly included a crown element. The evidence just reveals this consistent pattern. The British Crown wasn't a bystander. It was a consistent, active, driving force in establishing, expanding, and defending the transatlantic slave trade.
That's a truly stark picture. So far removed from the fairy tale versions of history we sometimes get, it really makes you pause.
It does.
And moving over to the Iberian monarchies, Spain and Portugal, their empires seem even more directly top-down, state-directed projects right from the start. How did they operate?
Indeed. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was, legally speaking, considered the private estate of the king.
His personal property.
Essentially, yes. The Spanish monarchy set up an incredibly centralized bureaucratic system to govern its colonies and extract wealth. You had the House of Trade, the Casa de Contratación, created way back in 1504, controlling all commerce, making sure gold and silver flowed directly to the royal treasury.
Right.
Then there was the Council of the Indies from 1524, the supreme lawmaking authority for the entire empire. And the vice-regal system placed the king's direct personal representative at the head of colonial administration. This whole structure was designed for absolute royal control.
And that control was used for?
Systematic exploitation, like the encomienda system, sanctioned by the crown. It started ostensibly as a way to Christianize indigenous people, but it quickly became a brutal system of forced labor and enslavement that utterly devastated indigenous populations. This happened despite courageous protests from figures like Bartolomé de las Casas. Humane considerations were largely overridden.
And you mentioned the Canary Islands conquest as a blueprint.
Yes, that conquest served as a grim blueprint for the Americas. It resulted in the death or enslavement of over 90% of the native Guanche population. A terrifying precedent.
And Portugal. Similar direct royal control.
Absolutely. The Portuguese Empire's origins are deeply rooted in the royal house of Aviz. Prince Henry the Navigator, a royal prince, led and sponsored those early maritime explorations. The crown asserted absolute control and monopoly over all new lands discovered, legitimized by papal bulls from the Pope.
So the Pope sanctioned it too?
Yes, giving it religious justification. Portuguese kings personally directed the imperial project, appointing viceroys, building forts, establishing hereditary captaincies in Brazil specifically designed for exploitation. The Portuguese Empire was, from its very inception, a project of, by, and for the crown.
Okay, so Britain, Spain, Portugal. Very direct royal involvement. What about the French approach to empire? How did that connect to his powerful monarchy, especially under someone like Louis XIV?
The French colonial empire was also intrinsically linked to the ambitions of its absolute monarchy. It was often framed by this royal-sanctioned ideology, the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission.
Right, the civilizing mission.
But in practice, as our analysis shows, this was often a convenient mask for brutal economic exploitation and, frankly, racist beliefs. Under King Louis XIV, the Sun King, it was a highly centralized, state-directed affair.
How so?
Well, individuals like Jean Talon were dispatched to New France, Canada, with explicit royal mandates to transform it into a self-sustaining colony that would directly benefit the French crown. The monarchy's primary economic interests lay in things like the fur trade in North America, but the most lucrative part was the Caribbean plantation economy, particularly Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti.
Haiti, yeah, known for its brutality.
It relied on one of the most brutal slave systems in history. And crucially, the French monarchy actively pursued access to and control over the African slave trade to fuel these incredibly profitable sugar plantations. It was central to their colonial wealth.
What's truly fascinating here, and maybe a bit different, is how the Russian Tsardom built its empire. More internally, right? Not so much overseas, but still using similar mechanisms of exploitation.
That's a crucial distinction, and it highlights the broader pattern, actually. Serfdom in Russia, which often became indistinguishable from chattel slavery in practice.
Wow.
It wasn't some ancient custom that just lingered. Our analysis suggests it was an outgrowth of state power, deliberately imposed by the monarchy. Tsarist decrees, ukase, starting around 1597, and especially the 1649 Code of Law, formally bound peasants to the land and to specific landlords.
So the state created serfdom.
Effectively, yes. It gave landowners almost unlimited ownership over their serfs. This system was, in essence, a delegation of the crown's power down to its nobility. In exchange for military and administrative service, the nobles got control over the serfs.
And the serfs labor-funded.
It funded the aristocracy, of course, but more importantly, it funded the vast ambitions of the Russian state itself. It enabled the czars to build a massive army, wage constant wars, and establish Russia as a major European power. You could argue, and this analysis does, that the Russian peasantry was essentially colonized by its own monarchy.
Colonized by their own rulers. That's a powerful concept.
Their freedom, their very lives, were sacrificed to fuel the Tsar's empire-building machine. So when you look across all these diverse monarchies, British, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, the consistent pattern is undeniable. The monarchical system wasn't just involved. It was the prime mover, its architect, and its greatest champion of global exploitation.
So the past isn't just history, is it? It's not locked away. This analysis makes it clear that it has powerful reverberations today. What about the staggering fortunes of modern royal families? Are they still tied to these historical roots of exploitation?
Absolutely. The fortunes amassed by the world's remaining royal families are immense, and our analysis shows they are fundamentally rooted in centuries of inherited assets, land ownership, and resource control that often began right in that monarchical colonial era.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. We see this with the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, estimated wealth over $1.4 trillion,
A trillion.
and the Al Nahyan family in the UAE, around $300 billion. Largely from oil and gas revenues, resources often first exploited under colonial or proto-colonial arrangements. Then you have the Thai monarchy controlling a colossal fortune, maybe $43 billion, from vast real estate holdings and investments built up over generations. The Grand Duke of Luxembourg estimated $4 billion. These aren't small figures.
No kidding. And the British royal family's wealth. That always seems a bit more maybe opaque. How does that fit in?
The British monarchy's wealth is indeed complex. It's kind of divided between King Charles III's personal fortune, estimated at over $1.8 billion. That includes inherited estates like Sandringham and Balmoral, art collections, jewels, investments, all passed down largely tax-free. And then there are the vast institutional assets, sometimes informally called the firm.
That's a firm, right. How much of that?
Estimated value around $28 billion. This includes the Crown Estate, which technically belongs to the reigning monarch in right of the crown. Its revenue mostly goes to the treasury now, but a significant portion comes back to the monarch as the sovereign grant, which pays for official duties and palaces. That was $86.3 million for 2022-23 alone. Plus, you have the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, which provide tens of millions in largely tax-free income directly to the monarch and the heir each year.
Okay, so enormous wealth. How is all this connected back to the historical exploitation we were just talking about? What's the direct link?
Well, this extraordinary persistent wealth is the direct legacy of a system built on global extraction. It's not just theoretical. Profits from the transatlantic slave trade and broader colonialism didn't just fund the British treasury back then. They literally fueled the Industrial Revolution and created vast private fortunes, some of which inevitably found their way into or supported the royal sphere.
Are there specific examples of royal involvement in that wealth generation?
Yes. More recent research has highlighted things like King William III receiving shares in the Royal African Company directly from the notorious slave trader Edward Colston back in 1689.
From Colston himself?
Yes. And digging further back, a direct ancestor of King Charles III, a man named Edward Porteous, was a 17th century Virginia tobacco planter. Records show he purchased over 200 enslaved people to work his plantations.
A direct ancestor.
A direct ancestor. So the wealth of modern royal families, the palaces, the jewels, the vast land holdings, it's just inextricably linked to plundered resources and the immense profits generated by forced labor over centuries. It's not a footnote, it's arguably the foundation.
So what does all this actually mean for the formerly colonized nations today? What are the economic, social, and cultural impacts that continue to cast this really long shadow?
Well, economically, the systems imposed by colonial powers were designed purely for extraction, right? Not for sustainable development. This led to a massive drain of wealth from colonies to the metropoles, the imperial centers.
Right.
Colonies were often forced into monoculture economies, just producing one or two cash crops or raw materials for the colonizer. This made them incredibly vulnerable and dependent. And this created a persisting neo-colonial relationship.
Neo-colonial, meaning?
Meaning, even after political independence, many of these nations often remained economically dependent on their former colonizers. They're perpetually locked into cycles of poverty, and there's this stark global income gap. Think about how many former colonies still primarily export raw materials back to their old imperial centers, often receiving low prices, while importing expensive manufactured goods.
Still trapped in that dynamic.
Exactly. And sociopolitically, colonial powers frequently used divide and rule strategies. They deliberately exacerbated ethnic or religious tensions to maintain control. We see the tragic consequences in places like Rwanda, with Tutsi-Hutu tensions that were solidified under colonial rule, ultimately leading to genocide.
Horrific.
And they drew arbitrary borders on maps, completely disregarding existing communities and ethnic groups. This created the foundations for civil wars and conflicts that sadly persist to this day in many regions. Plus, they often left newly independent states without experienced leaders or functioning institutions.
And culturally, the impact feels even deeper, doesn't it? beyond just the economics and politics.
Absolutely. Colonialism wasn't just political and economic domination, it was profound cultural imperialism. Colonizers imposed their language, their religion, their values, framing them as inherently superior. They systematically suppressed indigenous cultures, languages, spiritual practices, sometimes through incredibly brutal policies like the residential school systems in Canada or Australia.
Taking children away.
Yes, forcibly removing children to assimilate them, erase their culture. This led to a profound loss of cultural heritage and identity, the echoes of which are still deeply felt. And all this violence, the displacement, the cultural destruction, it's inflicted a deep and lasting psychological wound. There's a concept now explicitly used to describe this: intergenerational colonial trauma syndrome, or ICTS.
Intergenerational colonial trauma syndrome.
Yeah.
ICTS. Okay, for those of us hearing that for the first time, can you give us the quick rundown? What does that actually mean for people and communities today?
It's an incredibly important concept. ICTS really challenges the idea that trauma is just a past event, something individuals can simply heal from or move on from.
Right.
For colonized peoples, this analysis shows trauma is often a continuous and inherited condition. It's not just historical memory, it gets structurally reinforced by ongoing systemic issues.
Like what?
Like ongoing systemic racism, economic marginalization, police brutality, land dispossession, all direct legacies of colonialism that continue into the present day, constantly re-traumatizing communities.
So it's not just in the past.
Exactly. The trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, is continually reproduced through systems of racial oppression and inequality. Indigenous genocide trauma is perpetuated by ongoing land disputes, health disparities, lack of resources. This isn't just historical. This kind of trauma requires deep systemic change to even begin addressing it. It's arguably a public health crisis.
This raises a huge question then. What can actually be done about these lasting consequences? What's the current global call for justice looking like?
Well, there's definitely a growing global chorus demanding accountability and reparatory justice. This call is grounded in both moral and legal principles.
Morally and legally.
Morally, it acknowledges an unprecedented moral debt owed to the generations brutalized and exploited by these systems. Legally, there's the principle of successor government responsibility. It holds that states and institutions, including monarchies that directly benefited from these historical crimes, bear responsibility to provide redress.
And what does reparations actually mean in this context? Is just money?
It's much broader than just money, although financial compensation is part of the conversation. Reparations are multifaceted. They can include official apologies and meaningful truth-telling processes. Restitution, like returning stolen artifacts, such as the Benin bronzes to Nigeria.
Right, that's happening slowly.
Slowly, yes. Financial compensation can take forms like direct payments, development aid, or canceling unjust debts. Land-based reparations are crucial for many indigenous communities. And importantly, guarantees of non-recurrence commitments to dismantle the systemic racism and inequalities that are legacies of this history to ensure it never happens again.
Are there models for this?
Yes. Transitional justice models like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, as seen in South Africa and Canada, offer frameworks for confronting legacies of abuse and trying to build a shared, more honest historical narrative.
So where do modern monarchies fit into this call for accountability?
They fit right at the center, according to this analysis, as successor institutions that not only benefited hugely but often directly directed the brutalities of colonialism and slavery. Modern monarchies bear a unique and profound responsibility.
And how are they responding? You mentioned King Charles III expressing sorrow.
Yes, King Charles III has expressed personal sorrow about slavery and supported research into the monarchy's historical links. And those are, initial steps. But our analysis highlights, and many activists argue, that this falls far short of the formal apology and concrete commitment to reparative justice that's being demanded.
So sorrow isn't enough?
For many, no, because reparations aren't just about saying sorry for the past. They're fundamentally about addressing present-day global disparities in wealth, health, power disparities directly created by that past. ICTS, as we discussed, is a present-day public health crisis. Holding monarchies accountable is seen as a crucial and highly symbolic step in starting to deconstruct the unjust global system they were so central in creating and perpetuating.
Okay, so if monarchy carries this kind of legacy, this deep connection to unaccountable power and vast exploitation, then what are the alternatives? How do we actually design healthy, ethical governance that avoids these kinds of profound pitfalls?
Well, the fundamental case against monarchy based on this analysis is pretty clear. It's profoundly anti-democratic. It concentrates authority in one unaccountable individual chosen by birthright, not by merit or consent.
Right.
And as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum points out, that doctrine of divine right, or even just the mystique of inherited status, making the monarch seem above the law, it fosters fear, or at least deference, rather than trust. Plus, practically speaking, it's often an expensive institution funded by public treasuries or, historically, through exploitation.
But what about the argument for stability? Don't proponents say monarchy provides stability?
They do, and historically, hereditary succession did offer a simple way to avoid succession crises among the elite. But our analysis suggests that this stability role can be filled much more democratically today, and frankly, the very idea of hereditary privilege at the head of state is simply incompatible with modern principles of equality and fundamental human rights.
So what models for a post-monarchical society are out there? What can we learn from systems that have moved beyond this?
There's a whole rich spectrum of democratic models, thankfully. Many of the world's most stable democracies today are parliamentary systems.
Like in the UK, but without the monarch.
Well, the UK is a parliamentary system with a monarch as head of state. But many others, like Germany or India, have parliamentary systems where the executive, the prime minister, and cabinet is drawn from and accountable to the legislature, and they have an elected president as the ceremonial head of state instead of a monarch.
And republics.
Then you have various forms of republics where sovereignty rests explicitly with the people. Federal republics, like the US or Germany, divide power between national and regional governments. Unitary republics, like France, tend to concentrate power more centrally. Both, crucially, rely on elected representatives.
And beyond those more traditional democratic republics, our analysis mentions some more innovative ideas, really pushing the boundaries. Can you give us a quick taste?
Certainly. There are more radical ideas being explored, things like council democracy, which envisions a bottom-up structure where power flows from grassroots local councils, aiming for much more direct participation.
Okay.
And then there's demarchy, or sortition. This proposes using randomly selected citizens' assemblies or juries for certain government functions, like policy deliberation or oversight. The idea is to overcome the influence of special interests and ensure broader, more representative decision-making.
Random selection, like jury duty, but for governing.
Kind of, yeah. And it's also important to note how some nations have managed to sort of subsume tradition within democracy. Countries like the UAE or Malaysia have ruling families, or South Africa recognizes traditional leaders.
Right.
They show that monarchical or traditional figures can retain cultural and ceremonial roles, while the ultimate political authority rests firmly with a constitutional, elected government. It essentially strips the monarchy of its problematic sovereignty and its concentrated power, making it symbolic rather than ruling. These models fundamentally change how legitimacy, power, and accountability work compared to traditional monarchy.
So if we distill all of that, if we're aiming for healthy, ethical governance, what are the absolute core principles we should be looking for?
I think the core principles are pretty clear and hopefully universal. First, inclusivity and participation, ensuring all citizens have a meaningful voice and diverse perspectives are actually valued in decision-making.
Okay. What else?
Transparency and accountability. Government needs to be open, and leaders must be genuinely accountable to the people, usually through free and fair elections, robust checks and balances between branches of government, and a free, independent press.
Crucial.
Absolutely. Then, peaceful transfer of power. Clear, legal, non-violent mechanisms for leadership change are vital for stability, avoiding the chaos of succession struggles or coup. Very importantly, the rule of law, meaning everyone, individuals and institutions, including the leaders themselves, are subject to and equal before the law. No one is above it.
That's a big one compared to divine right.
Huge difference. And finally, a fundamental focus on collective well-being. The goal of the system should be to advance the good of the whole society and arguably the planet, not just serve the interests of a small ruling elite.
Okay, bringing it back to that systems theory idea one last time. How do these principles show up in the feedback mechanisms? Because that seems to be the real difference between monarchy and healthy governance, right?
Absolutely. That's a key insight from the systems perspective. Monarchy, as we've discussed, tends to operate on that positive feedback loop. Power leads to wealth, which leads back to increased power, further entrenchment. It's designed, consciously or not, to be self-perpetuating and profoundly resistant to change.
Right. It protects itself.
Exactly. In stark contrast, a healthy democracy is defined by its negative feedback loops. Think about what those are. Free and fair elections where incumbents can lose. The separation of powers preventing any one branch from dominating. Judicial review where courts can strike down laws. A free and critical press holding power accountable. The fundamental right to protest and dissent.
These are all checks, basically.
They're all essential self-correcting mechanisms. They're designed specifically to check and limit the concentration of power, to prevent tyranny, and to ensure the system can adapt to changing needs and public will. This institutionalization of corrective feedback, this built-in ability to course correct, that's arguably the essential feature of a healthy political culture. It's what monarchy inherently lacks.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has truly, I think, laid bare the institution of monarchy. When you strip away the mystique, look at it through that system's lens, it really is revealed as a system built on, well, unaccountable power and elite wealth. Fundamentally incompatible, it seems, with modern principles of equitable governance.
And the historical record, as we've seen, unequivocally shows that monarchies weren't just bystanders in colonialism, slavery, and serfdom. They were often the architects and the primary drivers. These weren't just incidental activities or unfortunate side effects. They were often core functions of the monarchical system itself, fueling its power, its prestige, and its very existence.
And those consequences aren't just confined to history books. We see them so vividly today, don't we? In the staggering fortunes of modern royal families, and in the persistent global inequalities and the deep-seated trauma that continue to affect millions across the world.
Precisely. Which is why calls for accountability and reparations aren't just about the past. They are urgent demands for present-day justice, directly challenging the legitimacy of institutions whose very foundations, this analysis argues, are built upon such profound historical injustices.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now, and how you view the symbols of power around you? Is monarchy merely a harmless tradition, something to be romanticized? Or, as our analysis strongly suggests, does its rightful place perhaps belong within the glass cases of a museum of political history, an artifact to be studied, learned from, so that its errors, its profound costs may never ever be repeated?
This is DigitView.